And thank you everybody who's joined. Hello everybody who's joining. I'll start at 5:30. I think Sajjad will also come by that time. And that's quite a good audience we have got today. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Shraddha. Hello Golden Period, whatever your name is. Hello, salam, walaikum salam. Uh, so I'm just waiting for Sajjad to join me. I have sent him the invitation. And till then, yes, Assalamu alaikum, Sajjad.
Assam, how are you?
So before I give introduction to Sajjad, I'd just like to tell you why we are doing this today. Today is the 19th of the month of Holy Ramzan, and on this date, in 661 AD, 40 Hijri, Imam Ali Islam came to the mosque in Masjid in Kufa for his morning prayers. He gave the call for Adhan and became engaged in leading the congregation. Abdul Rahman ibn Muljam, pretending to pray, stood just behind Imam Ali, and when Imam Ali was in a state of prostration, Abdul Rahman ibn Muljam dealt a heavy stroke with his sword, inflicting a deep wound on Imam Ali. This was the time when Imam Ali uttered his famous words, Fusta wa Rabbil Kaaba, by the Rabb of Kaaba, I am successful. He passed away 3 days later, and in these 3 days, he gave a lot of advice to his children, which Sajjad will be talking about later. I'll just tell you a little bit more. He told his sons, I advise you, my children, my household, and all those who may receive my message to fear Allah, to arrange your affairs well, to maintain good relations amongst yourself, for I have heard your grandfather, peace be upon him, saying, good relations are better than prayer and fasting in general. And that is why he's so relevant today. Now to introduce my guest today, Professor Sajjad Rizvi is the Director of the Center of Islamic Philosophy at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, and he specializes in Islamic philosophical and hermeneutical traditions. And I must tell you that I get a great sense of inferiority complex every time I see your library, and I wonder, I
No,
haven't even
you
heard of
shouldn't.
these books you
You
have a
shouldn't.
read. So welcome, Sajjad.
Thank
And as I had told you in my mail also, I have been posting a lot of Hazrat Ali sayings for the past many years since I've been on social media.
you.
And there's been a great engagement and interest in them. So before we start, could you just tell us a little bit about Hazrat Ali before we talk about his legacy?
Thank you for the opportunity, and it's of course very timely. Um, I think the simple things I can mention to begin with are basically who he is. So he was the cousin of the Prophet. He was also the Prophet's son-in-law. He was married to the Prophet's daughter Fatima. And he was around 20 years younger than the Prophet. So by the time the Prophet's mission came to its fruition, he was a young man. He'd been involved with the Prophet's mission right from the beginning. He's usually considered to be the very first person who joined the Prophet's mission, the first Muslim, as it said. Of course, whether it's him or whether it's the Prophet's wife Khadija, I think in many ways it's important that Khadija is as well considered to be the first Muslim. But certainly amongst men, he's considered the first. He was brought up by the Prophet because of the situation at the time of the family within the Banu Hashim, the clan of the Prophet. So he was very close to the Prophet from very early on. Of course, as I said, he's a son-in-law. He was, the warrior who was defending the faith, defending the Prophet in the early times. He was considered to be an authority in matters of the faith, but also more generally in authority. And I guess we'll talk about his kind of contributions to knowledge later. And after the Prophet's demise, he somewhat retreated. He remained kind of accessible to the communities afterwards, but he mainly retreated to his smaller circle of family and companions. At the murder of Uthman, who was the third caliph, Khalifa, following the Prophet, people turned to him and offered to pay allegiance to him as the Khalifa, and so he very reluctantly took that on. Certainly, Ali had no desire for power, and his period of about 4 years of being Khalifa was quite turbulent. There were lots of rebellions. He moved his center of the caliphate up to Kufa. Kufa was one of the new garrison towns of the empire in southern Iraq. And as you mentioned, it was in Kufa that he was struck by the sword of Ibn Muljam in 40 Hijri on the morning of the 19th of Ramadan, 661, and he passed through the due to the wounds that he received. Of course, throughout his period, especially after the Prophet, he saw his role, the Shia, but generally Muslims consider him to be an authority. So there are lots of sayings associated with him. There are sermons associated with him, particularly from his time when he was the Khalifa. There are letters that he wrote to people. So we have quite a large corpus of what he said. So obviously the things that you've been quoting will be from that corpus. They come in various hadith collections. They come in like Sunni hadith collections, they come in Shia hadith collections. But beyond that, the really important work is a work from the 4th century, which was compiled by Sharif al-Radi, who of course was a descendant. He was a Sayyid, a Musawi Sayyid. He compiled a collection called Nahj al-Balagha. So this would have been around the just at the beginning of the 11th century. And this collection includes a number of sermons of Amir al-Mu'mineen. So there are more than 200 sermons. There are letters, about 80 or so letters, and there are a number of short aphorisms, wisdom sayings. There are more than 200 of those as well. And so once he'd collected this, Sharif Radi wanted to present something which would be of interest to people in adab, right? So Radi was a very famous poet in Baghdad, and he had a circle of kind of udaba. And so he wanted to present Ali, Amir al-Mu'mineen, as a figure who was absolutely central to poetics, style, rhetoric, eloquence within the Arabic tradition. So his primary concern was actually not theological. It was about showing him as a significant figure within poetics and literature. And of course, this text has, over the centuries has become quite important. Gradually started being commented upon. There are lots of commentaries from the medieval period. And so certainly nowadays, the significance of the Nahj is that it's, of course, translated in many languages. Unfortunately, the vast majority of those translations are very bad in every language I can imagine. The translations in Urdu are pretty bad. The translations in English are hopeless. In many cases, the translations in English have actually been done from Urdu and not from Arabic. It's become a text where, certainly for a lot of people of a certain kind of traditional Muslim outlook, but certainly amongst those who are Shia, it's a work which they consider alongside the Quran as being authoritative, as being really significant. So if they want to understand their faith, if they want to understand the world and how we should live with each other, etc., then they often turn to the Nahj.
So the Nahjul Balagha that I have belong to my father,
Yeah.
and I'll have to check up who has translated it and from where it is. But I think it's from Iran. I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up because I just take for inherited it, so reading from it. So this brings me to another this thing that Ibn Shadam al-Qummi has quoted a hadith that if trees were pens and oceans inks and the jinn as count and humans as scribe, they would not exhaust the virtues of Ali. And then again we have hadith that Ana Madinatul Ilm Ali.
Yeah.
So, and I have seen several quotes of Rumi and Hafiz, which to me resemble Hazrat Ali's sayings. So could you talk about his scholarship, about the influence that he had on the famous Persian poet that we quote today, and generally on his, because he is somebody so special that he was not only a scholar, but he was also just as famous and as brave a warrior also. So it's a very rare combination.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we can talk a bit also about the reception of, I guess, what you would call the notion of chivalry, right? So what in Arabic was known as Futuwa, in Persian is Javan Mardi. You know, he was absolutely central for that. So, you know, warriors would all have, you know, La Fata illa Ali, La Sayfa illa Dhul Fiqar written on their swords. You know, there is no young warrior like Ali, and there is no sword like Zulfiqar, which is the famous heavenly bestowed sword that he had. And the chivalry, of course, was not just about fighting. It was about kind of values of how you live. It was about honor. It was about dignity. It was about protecting the honor and dignity of others. And so Javan Mardi was very much a tradition which traced itself precisely back to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And that tradition developed in lots of Persianate contexts in Central Asia and Iran, certainly in South Asia as well. So that's one aspect. On the kind of the reception in literature, I mean, I think it's quite clear that when one looks across the different languages, whether it's Arabic, Persian, Urdu, even Malay, you know, the figure of Ali as this kind of heroic figure, as a sage, comes up again and again. Poets in all of these languages, you know, famously wrote, you know, qasidas and sort of mud poetry, praise poetry for him. And certainly the quotation you gave from Shahdan al-Qummi, you know, there's a very famous verse which is often attributed to Maulana Rumi. Whether it is his or not is not so clear. But, you know, it's Awsaf Ali ba guftagu mumkin nist, gunjaish bahr dar sabu mumkin nist. You know, so the idea that, you know, poets cannot even capture the virtues and the excellences and what Ali is in the same way that a little cup cannot capture the sea, you know. So you have lots of these sorts of verses which are in the tradition, and as I said, every major poet has written a praise. I think in a language such as Urdu, it's even more kind of established. I cannot think of one major poet who does not have some praise of Ali in his divan. And even, sorry?
I said especially Ghalib in India and
yeah. I mean, all the kind of the greats, you know, the sort of the pillars of Urdu poetry, as they're called. Every single one of them has examples of that. Whether it's Mir, whether it's you know, Ghalib, whether it's Mir Dard, whether it's, you know, many others, and of course, and not just Shia poets, Sunni poets, Hindu poets. We have a large corpus of praise poetry of Ali written by poets who were, of course, theologically, confessionally Hindu. And that's, of course, partly because the culture, the kind of North Indian culture, particularly the Awadhi culture, was one in which these sorts of reference were absolutely central. And this was the way in which the Urdu language developed. So there's an extensive kind of literary reception as well. There are ways of there were also like genres in Arabic, in Persian, even Urdu, of collecting certain, putting together collections of his sayings. So like 40 sayings, 100 sayings, 500 sayings. There are lots of these across across the centuries. And often these particular kind of collections, sometimes called guldastas even, which were written for patrons, were, trying to show the significance of the figure, but also it was a way for a literary figure and for patron to to show their zawq, basically, right? It was also very much not just about some sort of piety, but it was also to show that they had an interest in refined things and in literature.
There's a question that has come. I think we can take that and then we can go to the next one. Can you reflect Hazrat Ali in context of ethics of warfare? Because since we were talking about his chivalry, we can put that here itself.
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of examples of that. I mean, Rumi famously quotes the encounter with in Amr ibn Abdul Wad in the Masnavi. So the famous one where a lot of these early conflicts, battles in early Islam often started with single combat, and Amr ibn Abdul Wad, of course, made a challenge, who wants to come and fight against me? No one does. Eventually, Ali steps forward, and he gets to a point where he has overpowered him and is about to kill him. And Amr, of course, famously spits in his face, and so he gets up and walks away, right? And then later on, he returns to the fight and he kills Amr. And Rumi discusses this, and he says, this is the classic example of the Madh-e Khuda. So, Ali for Rumi is the classical Madh-e Khuda. It comes up a lot. So it's not just it's a question of someone who fights purely for the sake of God, who lives purely for the sake of God, and is capable of making sense of what is appropriate for the situation, right? So, the Arabs famously had this notion of hilm. Hilm is very difficult to translate, but hilm is this idea of acting appropriately, acting not just appropriately in terms of who you are and who you're dealing with, but also knowing what is correct in the particular situation. So what is the correct situation in which you fight? What is the correct situation in which you do not fight? And you always keep sort of your higher values at the forefront. So, very much living in the shade of the divine presence. So being aware that God is, and being aware that you have obligations to God, but also obligations to your fellow human and to the wider environmental context in which you live.
So, you were talking about his sermons and his letters. There is this very famous letter that he wrote to Malik Ashtar when he was going to become the governor of Egypt. And that has values in it which are of great relevance even for today's modern generation. So can you just talk about that and the famous sentence from that we are all brothers either in humanity or in religion?
Yeah. So it's probably one of the longest texts within the Nahj al-Balagha, and it's been extensively discussed over the centuries. A lot of people quote this famous part of the 2002 Arab World Development Report, which was produced by the UN back in 2002, saying that if only Arab governments themselves, people making policy paid attention to this text, which of course is in Arabic, they might actually be able to deal with lots of the issues in their society. So there's a sense in which this is a very pivotal text, and it comes up again and again. I mean, people are familiar with it. Even people who haven't read the Nahj or even read the text are familiar with it. There's something about Muslim memory which works in a particular way that there's a familiarity with ideas and texts, even if you haven't actually experienced them directly yourself. So the text is a letter that he wrote to his lieutenant in many ways, Malik al-Ashtad, when he sent him as governor to Egypt. It's very interesting because Egypt at that time was, fairly recently been conquered. Most of the people in Egypt were not Muslims or were not really familiar with what the message of the Prophet was. Egypt was a terrain which was very distinct. It had the Nile, it had different kinds of agriculture. It was not just the desert. It didn't necessarily have the same kind of tribal systems, ethnicities, languages, religious practices, and so forth, cultural practices that the Hijaz, from which the early Islamic tradition developed, had. So a lot of his advice is that you have to treat people accordingly, right? So you have to be with the people. There are other advice to his governors where he also says that, look, when you're dealing with people, and this is mentioned in this Headnama, as it's called, as well, you don't want to discriminate and just deal with the elites. You shouldn't just deal with people who are rich and considered to be socially superior, because you have obligations to everyone. A governor has an obligation to everyone, and particularly those who are the weakest in a society. So you have to deal with them. And you have to deal with people across the board. So you cannot discriminate against those who have converted to Islam, those who are considered to be close to your religious views, and others. But you have to deal with people across the board, because humans are fundamentally a single family. This is very much a reflection of prophetic teachings as well. The idea of, we are all humans are from Adam, and of course Adam is from the earth, and so that's the reflection that the mutual bonds that we have of living and helping each other flourish is a reflection of the fact that, yes, we do have some who are part of a religious fellowship, but the vast majority of people that we encounter in our lives do not share our religious beliefs, but they are still common in our humanity. And so we have to have a sort of filial, warm, cooperative relations with everyone, regardless of whether they share your faith or whether they do not share your faith. And there's no kind of restrictions placed on that. It's not these hierarchies which people often talk about, different types of Muslims and then different types of monotheists, and beyond and on, and those who without faith. He doesn't even mention this issue of faith. He says there are either those who have the same faith and religious fellowship as you, and there are those who share this wider bond of human fellowship with you.
Which is such an message for today.
Yes, I think the ethical advice in the Ahad to Malik al-Ashtad is of two levels. One is the governance policy level, which in many ways is going back to an old kind of Aristotelian idea of public ethics. Politics is public ethics. It's not the exception or the coercion, but it's about or exercise of power. But it should really be about public ethics and friendship as a public value, and the personal kind of intersubjective ethics. How you deal with each other, how you deal with members of your family, how you deal with different communities, how you keep those who are poor and less fortunate and vulnerable. How do you take care of them and help them flourish, so that you're not discriminating in social ways against them. So yes, that's very much an essential element of that. Another text, of course, which is very famous, is his wasiyah, his testament to his son, which of course is in the Nahj as well. It's in the same section of letters. And that's a very, very long text. And it's a text which a number of people have discussed much more in the field of ethics, because, of course, it has a lot to do with parenting, right? It has a lot to do with the sort of advice you give. And it starts off by saying, this is addressed to, a father who is, close to his end. to his son who is young, but also has to recognize that his end will come, right? So that we are all fani. It's addressed to al-walad al-fani. So the idea is at one point your life in this world will come to an end. So it's a lot of it is about how you should behave with people, how you should of course be aware of God. The famous phrase which comes across in Arabic, "Usikum bittaqwa Allah." I urge upon you the taqwa of God, the awareness of God, the fear of God, if you will, is central, and also the issue of seeking knowledge, seeking advice, and also recognize that you will make mistakes, right? I mean, there's a wonderfully interesting paragraph where he says, "You'll make mistakes. That's fine. You'll learn from them." And at the end he says, "That's fine. You'll learn from them because I have confidence in myself and in you as my son, that you will know how to deal with that." And I think that's very positive as well. I think sometimes parenting is very challenging, so it's very easy to sort of say, no, you shouldn't do this, or don't do that, and you're going to make mistakes. That's really silly. But it's difficult to say. It's difficult for someone to say, yes, you will mistakes, but you will learn from them because I have confidence that you'll be able to handle it, and that takes something more.
Yes.
So I think that letter, that testament, that wasiyat, is an extremely significant text. And as I said, there were separate commentaries which have been written on that. Even quite recently, there's a very interesting book by Abdul Karim Surush called Hikmat wa Ma'ishat, which is very much about that text.
Somebody has asked for suggestions for must-read historically relevant books for Shia reverts and others. I think Hazrat Ali can be for everybody, so whoever reads can.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Nahj really is a very important text, and it was recognized as such. I mean, it'd be really good if people had access to good translations. I think this is a fundamental issue. I mean, there is a new translation which is kind of ongoing in English. Hopefully that will be out. But I think there's lots of things. Part of the thing with the Nahj is the basic content, what's being delivered. And of course, you can translate that in rather pedestrian ways. But there is a certain power of the language as well. There's an eloquence of the language as well, partly through the what's known in Arabic as sajja, which is rhyming prose, but partly of the way in which the language has been structured. And it's just a shame that most translations haven't been able to capture that. Some of the Persian translations are better, but there's still a lot to do there. And it's, someone once said to me, the problem with the Nahj is that it's too difficult, right? Yeah, the language is too difficult, even in translation. And he was talking about very bad translations. And so my response is, well, the way the Nahj is put together, it was designed to represent the highest possible achievements of Arabic literature, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean everything in it's going to be simple. There's a range of types of texts. The beauty, for example, of the aphorisms, the hikam at the end, is that they're very brief. They have an economy of words and style, but they convey quite a lot within it, right? So, the famous, there's one very famous saying which I like particularly, which is al-mar'u makhbut tahta lisani, right? So it literally means a person is hidden under his tongue.
Yes, I just quoted it a few days ago. I quoted
Now,
it reference to a conversation today also.
So
yes.
It has so much meaning in it, right? I mean, literally, does it mean, for example, you should be quiet if you have nothing to say? Does it mean that, you should be judicious about when you speak? Does it mean that it's through speech that we are recognized? I mean, there are lots of, different senses that we can draw out of it. But it's a simple phrase of 5 words, right? And there's a lot like that as well. So, I mean, what I'm trying to suggest is that the Nahj has a whole range of material in it, from the very simple to the very complex. And I often say this to my students, and a sign of a good work is that anyone can read it and derive something from it, right?
It should
If you basically pitch everything at a very simple level, then people who are slightly more sophisticated and more intelligent will be bored by it, right? So you've got to have material in it for everyone. And I think that's the real kind of achievement of the Nahj, is that it has something for everyone. It has something for those who are really interested in Arabic literature and linguistics. It has something for people interested in mysticism. It has something for people interested in philosophy. There's a lot there. That's why, if at times people do come across it and think it's a bit difficult, then that's a good thing, because that should kind of compel you, motivate you to try and make sense of it.
There is this famous saying of Hazrat Ali, which has been quoted very often, when he said, "Oh people, ask me before you lose me. By Allah, I have the knowledge of everything from the beginning to the end." And yet nobody, I think, did ask him anything.
Well, I mean, this is, or when they asked him silly things, right? So, the famous ones are like, "Tell me how many hairs were on the back of that donkey." And that sort of shows this issue of, he had to balance things. So, as the Prophet famously said, you've got to speak to people according to their ability to understand. So he did that as well. But there were many things that he was clearly frustrated by. We have these famous conversations that he has with one of his close companions, Kumail ibn Ziyad, who was also buried in Kufa. And he was very close to him, particularly in his period in Kufa. These are conversations about, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of the world? How do we understand the nature of knowledge? What does it mean to be an alim rabbani? So he talks about this idea of being a divine scholar, or someone who knows, who's in the divine gaze and presence. These are sort of sayings which were not necessarily public. We also have him complaining to Kumail and others, that people do not understand, do not take advantage of what he has, because of course he is, as you mentioned, he's the Bab Madinatul Ilm, in the famous saying of the Prophet. He is the gate to the city of knowledge, city of wisdom. And sometimes it's called sometimes a Bab Darul Hikmah as well. The gate to the house of wisdom. So there was an element of frustration, and there was I think a frustration about also what happened once he had become Khalifa, that he got embroiled in all of these rebellions, and these rebellions were fundamentally a distraction from his ability to teach, right? It was he had a certain responsibility. He was the bearer of, what is known as walaya. He had the authority, he had a status, he had this intimacy with the divine, following the Prophet. And so he had, he was the one who took on certain functions. He was the one who had to explain, for example, what the Quran was. So we have a very famous saying, where the Prophet says to Ali, I have been given the tanzil, I have been given the revelation, and I have fought for the revelation, and you will have to fight for the ta'wil, right? So you will have to fight to explain what the Quran is to people. There was that sense. We have, even in the battles, the famous one, the account of when someone, a Syrian, the Battle of Siffin was primarily with the followers of Muawiyah, who were considered to be Syrians in the accounts. So a Syrian comes up to him and in one case it's a Syrian, one case it's one of his own followers, but importantly it's a Syrian, so someone on the side, and he says to him, tell me about God, right? And so of course people around are saying, we're in the midst of a battle, you're asking about this, and Amir al-Mu'mineen stops. He says, no, this is what we're fighting for, right? So I have a role to explain what reality is. I have a role to explain what the faith is, what the religion is, and that's precisely what we're fighting for. So he had to stop and explain, who is God? Why should one believe in God? Have you ever seen God? What does that mean?
That's a very famous incident. And anyway, we talk about, there are some questions, but that we'll do later. This comes then to the next question, is that his legacy as we see it in Sufism, because in the subcontinent, and I think most of the people who are watching us today just now would be from the subcontinent, Sufism is a very, very live heritage and legacy that we have here. And the four major silsilas, 3 claim descent from Hazrat Ali. So can you talk about that, about his impact on Sufism, his contribution to it, and his relevant legacy in that?
So there are a number of elements of that. The first one is this the idea about the silsila, right? So of the orders tracing their silsila back to him. Incidentally, it's actually not. So it's famous about the Naqshbandis that they did not trace their silsila to Ali, but it's actually not true. So there are 3 silsilas amongst the Naqshbandis. And I think the reason why that idea has developed is mainly because of a certain reception of the line from Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, right, the Mujaddidi line. But amongst the Naqshbandis who were, came out of Central Asia, all of the Central Asian orders, where there was the Naqshbandis, where there was the Kubrawis, where there was Yasavis, etc., they all had this idea of the Silsilat al-Zahab, right, the golden chain. And the Silsilat al-Zahab was one which ended with Ali and actually went through the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt. So it went from Ali down to Ali al-Rida, and then it went to Ma'ruf al-Karhi, etc. So that is a very common lineage in Central Asia in the medieval period, which was then inherited by many others. Of course, then other orders, had different kind of lineages coming from Ali. But in effect, it's actually unthinkable to have a Sufi order which does not have a lineage going back to Ali. It's extremely rare for someone not to do that. So one element, of course, is this kind of tracing it. And the reason why silsilas are important is because a silsila provides the authority of a set of Sufi practices, right? Because it is tracing the history of that back to the Prophet. And it's tracing the history of back to the Prophet through Ali. So that's the reason why those silsilas are important. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, of course, is actual genealogy, right? So already in the medieval period in Central Asia, there was a growing trend that Sufi peers were basically Sayyids, right? They were descendants, which meant, of course, they were descendants of Ali and Fatima in particular. And this, of course, then became the case in South Asia as well. Now, in South Asia, I think what also happens is there's a slight shift. So, at the time, not many people really claimed that some of the famous Chishti sheikhs were Sayyids, but certainly nowadays they do, right? So I think the status and the prestige of Sayyids, and of course their association with being peers, became so stronger later that it was unthinkable to have a major sheikh in the early period, so that 13th, 14th century, who was not a Sayyid. And so that they have that kind of back projection. And now, of course, if you go around to the major shrines, in the Delhi area or in Khuldabad or anywhere in other parts of the UP, etc., all the Sajjada Nasheens are going to be Sayyids, right?
That
So,
yes.
and of course, they all claim descent from the saint who is buried there. So genealogy is another element of it. And of course, one of the really big elements is Qawwali, right? So, Qawwali certainly in South Asia is absolutely central to Sufi practice. And Qawwali, as we all know, is the utterance of the famous qawl, Man kuntu mawla fahadha Ali mawla, which the Prophet says is Ghadir, after the farewell pilgrimage, as it's called, whosoever I am Mawla of Ali is his Mawla, leaving aside what we might think Mawla means. And that's been absolutely central. So, devotion, praise of Ali in Qawwali is where you start. Many years ago, I was a second-year student at that time. At Oxford, we'd invited the late Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan to perform. And, various people were making suggestions for what he would sing, etc. And he started by saying, look, these suggestions are all well and good, but we have a certain tradition, right? And he said, our tradition is we start with one thing. And he said, we of course start with Man kuntu mawla. So, he said, this is our way. This is how we're trained. This is the Chishti Sabri way of doing things. And that's how we do it. And this is true of everyone. I mean, last year we, with some friends, we hosted some qawwals from Karachi in London, and they did exactly the same thing, right? So this is something which is extremely well known. The same thing happens in Nizamuddin. The same thing happens everywhere.
When
right?
I go every festival there, the Qawwali does start with this Man kuntu.
Exactly.
And something which I've been writing a lot about. Most people, like today also, I got a WhatsApp from somebody saying that a famous doha of Hazrat Amir Khusro. And I said, no, it is a call of Rasul Khuda.
Yeah.
So people have now started calling it a doha of Hazrat Amir Khusro. And very few realize this is actually Rasul Khuda ka call hai ye. So which is that I keep talking about quite often, that so that just, I suppose, shows the popularity of the Qawwali.
Yeah. I mean, even beyond that call, there's of course so many others, and there's one famous poem which I'm still trying to figure out where it comes from. It certainly was around by the 18th century. Sometimes it's associated with Rumi, although it's not in any of Rumi's published edited divans or any other works. And that's the famous Ta surat paivand jahan bud Ali bud, ta naqsh zami bud zama bud Ali bud. So this is, of course, you'll find this sung by many qawwals. And it seems to have been particularly become famous in the 19th century. I know lots of the sort of people I work on, philosophers in Iran in the 19th century. A number of them have commentaries actually on this poem. And in all of those works, it's attributed to Rumi, but it's kind of not known. And certainly that the way in which Qawwali brings in that sort of Persian and Arabic poetry, which is in praise of Amir al-Mu'mineen, not just in the actual Man kuntu mawla, but into all sorts of other qawwalis, right? So even if you have a slightly more Ghazali type qawwali, it's never free of the mention of Ali. And so I think that's you can't have qawwali without it. It's impossible.
Because it's either that, or they'll start with Sher Khuda, Shah-e Yazda, otherwise that Bu Ali Qalandar's famous work.
Exactly, yeah. Or like Muhyiddin Chishti's verses, or yes.
So since I work with monuments and I've been visiting dargahs all over India in the past 3 years, and wherever I have gone, whichever कोई भी सिलसिले का जो भी दरगाह है, जिस भी सिलसिले की है, और अगर वहाँ कव्वाली हो रही है, तो हजरत अली का जिक्र तो आता है. So
उसके बगैर कव्वाली होती नहीं है.
बिगेस्ट लेगेसी. और आप जिक्र कर रहे थे, तो मैं लखनऊ की हूँ. मतलब हूँ तो अलीगढ़ की, बट आई वाज ब्रॉट अप इन लखनऊ, एंड अवध का जो कल्चर है, तो हम लोग सब, हमें याद है कि बचपन में कोई भी शायद ऐसा नहीं था जो याली मदद ना करता हो. So that was, it became a part of our culture. It was
Yeah.
irrespective of religion. And आज भी I'm very scared of air travel. So मैं बहुत मुश्किल से हवाई जहाज में बैठती हूँ, and that becomes a big problem for me. But जब मैं बैठती हूँ, so I start by याली मदद until चाहे वो कितने भी घंटे की journey हो. Like last year I came to San Francisco. That was a 16 or 17-hour journey. तो इट्स नॉन स्टॉप. मेरे दिमाग पे सिर्फ याली मदद ही रहता है. ना कीप थिंकिंग के मौला सोचते होंगे कि मतलब आई हैव नथिंग एल्स टू डू एक्सेप्ट होल्ड हर हैंड व्हाइल शी इज ट्रैवल फीलिंग स्केर्ड इन अ plane. But that again is another big legacy of Hazrat Ali, that कभी भी कोई जो कहते हैं ना मुश्किल कुशा, कि कुछ भी किसी को अगर जरूरत है कुछ है, तो हम पुकारते तो उन्हीं को है. And that again is irrespective of, as I said, in Awadh, at least in the Lucknow area, everybody does that. Yali madad sabhi kehte hain. So can you just talk a little bit about that also?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the sort of centrality of devotion, right? So, traditional Muslim societies, but also, what are called Islamicate societies, societies which are informed by the culture and practices and language. This is central to those societies. Of course, the problem is that things have changed in the last century or so, and nowadays, unfortunately, there'll be places where you've got to be very careful. So, I've certainly been in situations in the past. To take two examples, Syria or Saudi Arabia, where you get into a taxi and you have to be very careful what you say. So, it's not even just about Ali, it's also about the Prophet. You've got to be very careful. I mean, the devotion is something which is absolutely central. And I think it's unfortunate that this kind of devotional element of everyday language and practice, which was very much part of the Muslim world and the Islamicate world, in fact, has really come under attack from two sides, right? So it's come under attack from, let's not mince words, it would come under attack from those we call Wahhabis, right? Or Salafis on one side. And on the other side, it's basically come from people who consider them to be modernists and rational and think that this stuff is superstitious and, it's not in keeping with what the modern world is. That kind of has they both have their own kind of baggage about what modernity is and what tradition is and what is the nature of our intellectual and cultural inheritances. It's just unfortunate that there hasn't been enough of the pushback on that. And there's also a sense in which both Wahhabis and modernists are literalists, right? So they take things at face value. They literally think, oh, this is shirk, or this is nonsense because it's supernatural. Yeah, they don't understand the way in which language actually works in people. So, a few years ago, I gave the example of the famous Qawwali Gorak Dhanda. Now, if you take a lot of the words literally, it sounds very problematic, right? But poetry does not work that way. Poetry is about an expression. It's about it's an effective medium. It's not maths. It's not a very simple thing where meaning has to be taken at the most immediate face value. It has to be far more kind of appreciated in a wider context. And I think that's that wider context which is often missing, and that's why people are beginning to really have an issue with that sort of traditional devotion.
So one question that has come, and we've got just little about 10 minutes more. Somebody said, before you wind up, please talk about Hazrat Ali's famous words which he uttered when he was struck by the Rab of Kaaba, I am successful. Yeah. What does that mean? And the second question is, Sughra Fatima has said that I find Nahjul Balagha very difficult. Can you tell me how to understand? So can you take both these?
I mean, the second one is easier. there are sort of selections of the Nahaj, which might be the way of going back about it. I mean, I have one lying around somewhere. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was published in Lahore a while ago. So it's a selection in Urdu of about I'd say about 50 sermons and about 20 letters. I can find the reference for you later, and that's actually quite nice because it simplifies it, and the Urdu is very nice as well because that's one of the issues. You've got to make sure that you retain some of the element of the stylistics. So one way could be to actually access things through little summaries or shorter versions, because as I said, the full translations usually are very bad. On the Fustu wa Rabbil Kaaba, so this goes back to this idea that from the earliest period, Amir al-Mu'mineen saying and speaking to the Prophet and saying, look, I really my brothers who have gone forward and have been martyred, including his own brother Ja'far, who was martyred in Mu'tah. His shrine, of course, is now quite nicely built in Jordan. They've been successful. They've been martyred in the way of God, and that was his notion of success. So, martyrdom has, of course, two levels. It's the kind of the witnessing of truth. And of course, he did that throughout his life. But he considered, there's elements of both the good life and the good death. That's one of the things that, you get from Amir al-Mu'mineen, is precisely this idea that there is both a good life and a good death. And a good death doesn't mean, of course, that's for everyone, that everyone should be killed in the path of God or martyred in that way. But that was for him a culmination of a life well lived. And so in that sense, it's the idea of success. The good death, the death of a martyr, was a culmination of his life, which was spent witnessing the divine, witnessing and explaining what the divine was. And Rabb al-Kaaba, of course, it's about coming full circle because, of course, he was born in the Kaaba.
Born over there.
So the choice of Rabb al-Kaaba, I think, is very deliberate to express this idea of, there's a cycle of life. He's born in the house of God. He dies in the house, or at least he's mortally wounded in the house of God. So there's that as well.
I remember 2010, I think, we went to Kufa, and standing there in the Masjid-e-Kufa, you start getting goosebumps out there when you realize that and when we went to the house and we were shown, we had gone with when we were taken around.
Yeah.
And I remember, shivering literally at what we were witnessing, where we were. I don't know whether now kab ziyarat hogi, but Behral, I was lucky to have gone there twice. Yeah. There's one now that is up to you whether you want to take it or not. Human is asking, do you think Islamic history would have been different if Hazrat Ali had been the first caliph?
Well, of course it would, because anything would be different. But in some ways, it's not terribly useful to think in that way. I mean, one of the things about life is that things are not easy. The inheritances that we have, the way in which we look at our history, it's difficult. You have to struggle with it. Yes, if the Prophet and then Amir al-Mu'mineen and the whole, if they had established a heaven on earth, then really there'd be nothing for us to do anyway. So life is a struggle. The hadith certainly that we have in the Shia tradition, in Al-Kafi, etc., is that the aim of there's three kind of outcomes you want in life, two of which are not open to us. One is to become a close angel, one is to become a prophet who is sent by God, and the third one is to become a person, a mu'min, a believer whose heart has been tested for faith, right? And that test is precisely the everyday life we live, right? It's not. Life is not easy. It never has been. The current situation in which we're living exacerbates and enhances some of those elements, but it's not easy. So even as they say, for just a simple believer, being tested with trials every 40 days. So how would one expect that not to be the case for someone like Ali? And we're talking about serious trials. It's not like your Wi-Fi is dropping, for a few minutes. It's like serious kind of challenges, and when you come through that, and I mean come through that, not necessarily succeed. That's really important. That's the whole idea. Coming back to that famous wasiyah to the son, where he says, you will make mistakes. You
Let's
will
end
make
on
mistakes and go through them. Yeah.
that, on the wasiyat that he gave, because there are so many aspects to it in which he talks about everything, about how to behave, how to,
Yeah, it's a very detailed text. I mean, the text is one of the longer ones. It's not quite as long as the. It's actually very similar, actually, in length to the letter to Malik al-Ashtar. And certainly, I would say that if people want to familiarize themselves with the Nahaj, they do well to look at that, as well as. I mean, I think that there are three which I often discuss, which I would say that you really should look at. There's others, but the first one is the very first khutbah, which is about creation, and it's about the Quran. It's about the creation of the cosmos. It's about the creation of Adam, and it ends with a very interesting passage about the Hajj. And the Hajj as a renewal of the covenant and understanding the nature of the creation. That's the first one. The second one is, as I said, the wasiyah to the son. And the third one is the ahad to Malik al-Ashtar. And so in that you have your metaphysics, you have your metaphysics, you have your very significant theology, you have your ethics, and you have your politics. And that's pretty comprehensive.
So a lot of commentaries have been written on whatever his sermons from a point of view of.
Yeah, I mean there were commentaries from the earliest period. Already from. I mean the earliest commentaries are beginning of the 12th century, but the really big commentaries that are famous. There's Ibn Abil Hadid, which is about 150 years afterwards. You have Maytham Bahrani, who's around later part of the 13th century. And then, I mean, you have this huge one in the 19th century by Habibullah Khoy, which goes into 20 volumes in Persian. So, I mean, there's everything. And some commentaries are more interested in language. Some commentaries are more interested in history and the theology. Some of the commentaries are more interested in the mysticism. So, you have there's one 15th century commentary, and I can't remember the name of the author. It's a 2-volume work, and it's entirely a mystical commentary. So you have all sorts of commentaries written, and of course in the modern period you had the famous edition of Muhammad Abdo, the Sheikh al-Azhar, and the Mufti at the end of the 19th century, and in many ways the modern Arabic literary reception of the Nahaj has a lot to do with Muhammad Abdo, who of course is a very major intellectual figure in terms of what's called pan-Islamism and that sort of modern Muslim nationalism as well.
Would you like to recommend some books for people who'd like to read more about Hazrat Ali for general readership?
I think so. There are at least a couple of books written by my friend and colleague Reza Shah Kazmi.
Went off without any warning.
Yeah, no, I think it's probably.
And
it's probably been an hour. That's why.
Can you just complete the list of books that you were doing? And thank you. Wonderful talk and telling us so many things. I've learned such a lot. I'm sure a lot of other people would have also learned a lot from this.
Yeah, so what I was suggesting was there's an older book that Reza Shah Kazmi did on the question of remembrance. I think that came out at least 10 or more years ago. There was another volume which was on Imam Ali, edited by Ali Lakhani. And Reza actually has a new book which is just about to come out, which is on, which I think should be quite interesting. I mean, he described it as a book on Amir al-Mu'mineen, which Shias won't like because they'll think it's too Sunni, and Sunnis won't like because they'll think it's too Shia. So that should be interesting, and that's just about to come out. I can't remember the title of that, but Reza's work is usually very good on this sort of stuff. It's accessible. He's very much interested in the spiritual sort of Sufi.
Accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
You know? And, that a lay person can also read it as well. It should be able to everybody.
Yeah, I think those works are good examples of ones to have a look at. Yeah.
So you can maybe recommend that in one of your posts. You can write the names.
Yeah, sure. I'll dig up the references for you. That's fine.
Having a shelf of Hazrat Ali's books also.
I actually don't. I mean, my copy of the Nahaj, I only have this small one, which I really like. I got this a few years ago in Najaf. It's published by the Haram, and it's actually a very nice edition. I've been trying to get like a big version of it, but I haven't been able to find it. Especially since my eyesight is getting really bad, so I need to use reading glasses to read this. But yeah, this is my Nahaj. I do have a couple of translations somewhere, but I never use them. I never look at them, so they're probably upstairs.
But you can send a picture of your bookshelves where you have all the books on Hazrat Ali and your Nahaj, etc., whatever other commentaries you have.
Sure.
Because Asa, I don't know the Asa Zande, she's saying that what is the name of Raza's book?
So one is, let me just Google it. The one is, I think it's Spirituality and Remembrance or something. Let me have a look.
Mir Mukhtar, we are just coming. Sajjad is giving us the book names. Just hold on.
Yeah. So as I said, there's an older one and there's one which is just about to come out. So just, let me try. Right. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is a bit slow. That's all. Yes. So the new one is called Imam Ali from Concise History to Timeless Mystery.
Okay, I think I saw this book, and there was a book on Hazrat Ali which I ordered just before the lockdown, and this was it, and it got cancelled because of
Yeah, so that's out, and then there's the older one is called Justice and Remembrance. And that one in particular looks at the letter to Malik al-Ashtar. So it's called Justice and Remembrance, Introducing the Spirituality of Imam Ali. There is also this thing, The Sacred Foundations of Justice in Islam, the one which is edited by Ali Lakhani, and that has, that's basically, it's called The Teachings of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And then there's also like, there's that one which Reza also did like this occasional papers for the Institute of Ismaili Studies, which was called Spiritual Quest, and that's again the same kind of material. But yeah, I mean, I saw he showed me a copy of the new book a few months ago, but I haven't got it. Because he'd only just received his first copy and he said, I can't give you this, but I'll send you one. He hasn't got around to sending me one yet.
Just trying to see was the book that I had ordered, and
yeah, it's probably for this one, From Concise History to Timeless Mystery. That's
I think that
one. Only. Yeah, that's the most recent one.
I ordered it just before the. Yes, here it is. I ordered it just before the lockdown, and so then it got cancelled. Yes, you're right. It's Imam Ali by Raza Ali
Raza Shah Kazmi, yeah.
From concise history to timeless mystery. I'll just show
Yeah.
it to you.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
Right? This is the book. I
Yeah.
had just
Yeah.
I just ordered it and it got. It'll be delivered now once the lockdown is over. And
Yeah.
thank you once again, Sajjad. I'm sure
No
you must
problem.
have
Welcome.
a session at 8:30, and this must be a different experience for you because every day you are grilling people.
Yeah, in fact,
I,
I'm doing one in about 2 hours.
uh,
So
so
this
to go,
this week is really is busy because I've got one every day, but I'll be done at the end of this week. So I'm handing over to my colleagues. So
I said I join in on your conversations just to try and learn something more. Very illuminating conversations that you have and very illuminating conversations that we had today. Thank you so much.
okay, thank you. All right. Bye now.